Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the IISS. I am Virginia Comolli, Senior Fellow for Conflict, Security and Development. It's a great pleasure to have you here this morning for the launch of our monthly series of IISS conflict briefings. I'm responsible for the Conflict, Security and Development program, which is home to IISS main conflict-related publications. One of those publications is the Armed Conflict Database, and that is the source of many of the information and data that will be informing today's discussion. We have realized that we do indeed produce a huge amount of information and analysis on conflict, and we're always trying to find new and useful ways to use the information and to share the information with our members and our constituencies. So I hope you will find this briefing of interest. We actually look forward to your feedback. I'll let you know at the end of the briefing how you can share your feedback. And for that reason, we've also encouraged people to submit questions ahead of the briefing. So thank you to those who have done so, because we have used your questions to shape our discussion. So you'll see the answers being incorporated in that discussion. And if we don't do that, we'll actually answer them explicitly later on in the course of the briefing. So every month we'll pick one conflict and we'll zoom in on that conflict and trying to see how we got to where we are and the implications of main developments in that conflict area. So we decided to pick Syria as the conflict with which we are going to start this series of conflict briefings. As I've already alluded to, the format is going to be a bit different from traditional ISS events. It's going to be much more interactive with people joining here in the room, but also people joining us by webinar. So good morning and welcome to those who are listening in. And also, I'd also like to remind them that they can participate actively by submitting their questions through the chat function. And my colleague Nick Crawford here will be relaying those questions to us. We won't have formal presentations. We'll start with a conversation between me and our panelists here, and then we'll open up to the floor for all of you to ask questions and to share your views. The whole discussion is going to be on the record, and to make it a bit more exciting, we are going to show you some maps and other visuals and graphs as we progress in the course of the briefing. All these briefings will feature in-house experts, and every time we'll bring in our ACD, Armed Conflict Database researcher for the specific conflict. In this case, Katie Walsh, who covers Syria for us. Katie's been with us for about a year covering Syria. So she has a very in-depth, granular knowledge of what is happening in Syria at present. And before joining us, Katie was based in Beirut, working for an NGO focusing on the protection of civilians in Syria and in Yemen. And she's joined by our senior fellow for the Middle East, Emil Okayem. For those of you who were attending previous ISS meetings and briefings, well, you don't need me to introduce Emil at length. Emil has been conducting extensive field research in Syria and other parts of the Middle East. He has been quoted widely in the media, and his Adelphi book on Syria is certainly an excellent contribution to the broader debate on the Syrian conflict. So I think this is just an introduction of how the day or the morning is going to work, and perhaps we could just launch into it. And I'll start posing some questions to Emil and Katie. So Syria has been at the set of a very deadly and disruptive conflict for about 7 years, so producing or generating levels of displacements that had hardly ever seen before. But Syria is also placed in a region that sadly is already associated with instability, insecurity, and conflict. Can you please help us put things into perspectives and tell us how Syria fit into the broader regional arena? So what is the scale of the problem?
Good morning to all. Thank you, Virginia. Syria, the Syrian war is the defining conflict of the contemporary Middle East. It is really geographically at the heart of a region that has been extremely unstable in the past few decades. But what makes Syria special in a way is the fact that all these forces that have expressed themselves the most during the Arab uprisings just came together in the worst possible way. Whether we're talking about strategic rivalries, the role and place of political Islam in the debate, the attempts at demographic engineering, the impact on the neighborhood, the way the neighborhood was sucked into Syria, and the way Syria affected its neighborhood. I mean, it's quite unprecedented. I mean, typically, and this is mostly towards Western audiences. The view from about the region is essentially shaped by the Iraq War. Because your countries have contributed massively to that, the costs in terms of toxic politics, your own young men and women, your own tax dollars and tax pounds, etc., were all invested there. But I would argue that from a regional perspective, the Syrian war will stand out because of the amount of damage done, because Syria is a relatively poor country that will never be able to self-finance its own reconstruction, its own stabilization, because the conflict, while ongoing, is unlikely to generate an inclusive political solution. I mean, even in Iraq, the kind of political settlement that has emerged is still more inclusive, more respective of minority views and minority communities, etc. In Syria, there won't be an agreed settlement. There will likely not be an agreed settlement that is actually satisfactory and takes into account the suffering of the past 7-8 years. On top of that, I would argue that the magnitude of the jihadi problem coming out of Syria was unprecedented. Of course, Iraq was really the beginning of this process. But today, I mean, whether it's HTS, aka Nusra, aka many other names, in Idlib, or ISIS, or so, it's really the Syrian war that created this security vacuum that jihadi groups were able to use. And finally, from the perspective of the international order, international norms, etc., the use of chemical weapons in Syria, the massive hesitation in Western countries, etc., have contributed. It's certainly not the primary or the sole factor, but it was a contributing factor to the sense of Western disarray when it comes to international politics. So it's very difficult to see how Syria can be put together. The only solution that one can foresee right now is the authoritarian peace that is being enforced, which is no real solution. But
and how does in terms of the death and the disruption and destruction, how does Syria compare with other conflicts that are currently ongoing in the region?
Well, it's actually important to, I mean, we put the graph behind us just to illustrate, the amplitude, the magnitude of the Syrian conflicts compared to the others. It certainly doesn't mean that there's not suffering or anything bad elsewhere. The point here is to say that when it comes to direct casualties, Syria is way ahead of other countries. Yemen is a place where we suspect, although the reporting isn't totally complete, that the number of indirect deaths from the conflict because of starvation, because of lack of access to health services, because lack of access to food and etc. Is actually quite high. But in terms of direct casualties, Syria is certainly ahead. I would argue that also in terms of infrastructure destruction, Syria is in a much worse place because the various actors were much better armed because of what was deployed on the battlefield, because of the kind of fighting that occurred that was very much urban rather than front lines in rural areas. I'll let Katie talk a bit about the IDP refugee situation, which remains.
Yes, indeed, because we, as we all know from headlines, that the Syrian conflict has had a huge humanitarian impact.
Yeah, we really can't overemphasize the scale of the humanitarian impact. I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. We have like around 400,000 casualties and then 6.5 over million IDPs, and many of these live in hard-to-reach areas, like they don't have a lot of access to aid or basic humanitarian supplies. And we've just seen huge levels of devastation. As Emil said, there's been numerous chemical attacks. We've had civilians used as human shields. We've had forcible displacement. We've had siege and starvation as a weapon of war. And as Emil said, there has been devastation and similar levels of fatalities elsewhere, but Syria just blows all these numbers out of the water, really, because we have so many refugees in neighbouring countries. We have around 3 million in Turkey, over 1 million in Lebanon and Jordan, and many of these also live below the poverty line. So even once they've escaped the violence in Syria itself, they're still not facing any better conditions once they've fled this violence.
Yeah. One aspect of the Syrian conflict that I would say makes things extremely complex is the fact there are so many different actors, regional and international actors involved in the conflict. Can you give us a sense of how the conflict has actually affected the geopolitics of the broader region?
Certainly. I mean, Syria is a fully regionalized and fully internationalized conflict. It's a place at the moment where you have the flags of 5 very powerful countries flying over the country on top of that of the Syrian government and the rebels and so on. Israel, well, ever since 67, 73. Turkey, Russia, the US, and Iran. So, as you can see from this map that dates from a couple of months ago, we're talking about a significant foreign presence in the country. The Russian and the Iranian presence are by invitation of the Syrian government, so they have legal standing. The Israeli presence, well, it's the annexation of the Golan Heights, which is internationally not recognized, but Israel is operating all across the Syrian territory. In the past year, we saw them operating as far as Abu Kamal. And just a few days ago around Latakia and so on. And then Turkey and the US are two powers that occupy or are present on pretty big chunks of the territory. As far as I'm concerned, I suspect that this Afrin pocket that extends into the so-called Euphrates Shield area are mini Turkeys at this point. It's difficult to see a scenario in which Turkey will abandon those two unless there is a great settlement with that the Russians broker or force onto the Turks. The US itself has just announced, I don't know if you saw yesterday, John Bolton and Jim Mattis, that they will stay in Syria as long as the Iranians stay in Syria. And the Iranians will tell you, we're staying in Syria as long as the Americans are there. So, job security, I'll be analyzing this for the next 30 years. But the point is that you do have substantive military presence and massive logistics to sustain that. And both, I would argue that the Iranians have a good concept of what they want to achieve. I'm not necessarily saying that it is achievable, but they've managed to secure their first goal, which was to preserve the Assad regime. The second and third goals, which are to essentially develop a front against Israel, is a second front to the north against Israel, is much more difficult to achieve. But that's, I think, going to be a focus of Iranian security policy. And the third goal is going to be to try and kick out the U.S. From northeast Syria, which could be achieved. When you look at historical precedent. I mean, try to imagine, or it can go really wrong. In 1983, a very powerful U.S. force in Lebanon departed very quickly after massive bombings at the Marine barracks. That's essentially the template that the Iranians and others are looking at. How to drive up the cost to the U.S. and basically expose the gap between U.S. intentions and the reality of U.S. strategy, which is not built on any real existing political process. The U.S. also lacks local partners and hasn't been able to embed itself the same way that the Russians, the Turks, the Iranians have. The Kurdish organization, the PYD, YPG, that the U.S. is backing, is certainly thinking a lot about hedging these days. Who's in the game to stay, who can deliver political benefits, security guarantees over time. So it's still very much an unsettled battlefield. It's difficult to say clearly who won totally. I mean, Syria is a place where words have just stopped meaning much in this regard. But we know who lost. The mainstream rebellion is a thing of the past. It's simply not a political or military actor at this point. And we saw this ever since 2016, and this year was quite stunning, if expected, defeats in the south and so on. So we've moved to a new phase, I would argue, since the fall of Aleppo, where it's really the regional powers that are fighting to shape a Syria that Assad will mostly control.
You've already alluded to this, but can you tell us a bit more about who are the remaining groups that are fighting on the ground?
I think when it comes to these groups, I mean, this is Syria, so it cannot be easy. We try to actually map this what's happening on the ground. It's the most dizzying array of forces with the most dizzying array of calculations. So what we try to do here, and which will be reflected in the ACD and so on, is to look at the main form of interactions between those various groups. Direct conflict, military partnerships, what we call cooperation competition, because we see this quite a lot, where actors are locked in certain dynamics in some parts of the country and others elsewhere, or have, are themselves, struggling to understand how they relate to another actor. And then what we call the confliction and of restraint. The confliction can be actually formalized, as is the case between the US and Russia, or even Russia and Israel. Let's see how that goes in coming days. But you do have all these behaviors that we see on the ground. Obviously, you have the Jihadi universe that, it's, I'm sorry, I'm colorblind, so someone has to tell me what color that is. Red. So, it's all red when it comes to the Jihadis. But elsewhere, it's a great rainbow, as you can see. The question really here is whether the various regional and international actors are willing and able to sustain their local partners enough for a potential political opening. And in this sense, the Turks are quite committed to, for instance, what the National Liberation Front and the Syrian National Army, because without these, Turkey would be quite exposed on its southern flank. It would lack the tools to contain and fight the Kurds. Then, if you look at the regime Iran pull here, they have quite a lot of muscle deployed on the ground, muscle that can be mobilized quickly in case of a future conflict. The question really is, does Iran have what it takes to sustain this this complex? I mean, financially and in terms of a strategic need and so on. So, at this point, anyone who tells you we've reached an end game in Syria is selling you hot air at this point, because all these relationships are still quite volatile. Again, we can tell you who already lost in Syria. It's very difficult to tell you precisely who won. I would argue that the regime won because its standards definition of victory is much lower than other groups. What it wanted primarily was to survive. It didn't define victory in terms of the needs and demands of its population. Otherwise, Syria would have played out very differently since 2011. For other actors, when you talk to them, interviews with officials, sometimes Syria feels like an entanglement, a place where you're constantly paying a cost to preserve a position without necessarily being able to define what is the preferred, but certainly not what is the most realistic end goal from this perspective.
Thank you. Well, the conflict seemed to have entered a new phase with the battle for Idlib, and we saw in the last week that an agreement had been reached between Turkey and Russia. Can you tell us a bit about what the implication or the content of the agreement and the implications of that agreement?
Sure. Katie will address what was actually the key concern for Turkey, which is the humanitarian and security spillover into Turkey. I'll look more at the geopolitical aspect of this. I'll stand up again just so. Essentially, the build-up to the Idlib campaign was, provided headlines for the past few weeks. Then we had the agreement in Sochi a week ago. I suspect that this is not an agreement that's going to hold a long time. What the Turks have done is buy themselves some time. I suspect the Russians didn't want to pay massive reputational costs ahead and during the Onga session that just opened. And they were also quite mindful of their bilateral relationship. So, the Russians were looking for ways to keep Turkey on board. Essentially, when you look at the agreement, it places massive demands on Turkey in a very short time frame. I mean, if you look at the text, it says that Turkey needs to remove all the radical terrorist groups by October 15. First, as far as Russia is concerned, a bit everyone is a radical terrorist group. And second, it's October 15, which is 2 weeks from now. And we're talking about a variety of jihadi groups there. If we adopt our definition of what a radical terrorist group is, HTS, Haras ad-Din, Al-Ansar, etc., who are basically based around those regions here. So, they need to be defeated in that time frame. How, with which forces, whether other rebel groups will accept to do that, knowing that they suspect, and I say rightly so, that once this is done, then the regime is actually militarily more able to conquer that territory because those forces will be defeated, weakened, etc. I don't know. The second point relates to the so-called demilitarization zone, which is shaded here. When you look at a lot of maps that came out, the agreement talks about a 15 to 20 kilometer demilitarization zone. A lot of maps that have circulated have somehow assumed that it would be 7.5 or 10 kilometers into regime-held area, and then 7.5 and 10 kilometers into rebel-held area. If you look at the text of the agreement, and if you look at the discussions since then, that that haven't gotten a lot of attention, actually the demilitarized zone is going to be inside the rebel-held area, inside the de-escalation zone. So basically, it will amount to, it will actually militarily weaken the rebellion quite substantively. It will expose a lot of, these are big population centers around here, etc., that will be live in a demilitarized area, which in a way would be good for them. But look at it from the perspective of armed rebel groups. They are abandoning the most important ground for them. The de-escalation agreement, the Sochi agreement, also stipulates that Turkey needs to guarantee traffic along the M5 and M4 highways, and that has been a key demand of the regime for some time. It needs to restore the semblance of normalcy, trade, along to Aleppo in particular, which is still a massive, big city in Syria. The Turks have seen this as economic normalization as a way to entangle the Russians, to say, look, we can offer you all these things that would stabilize the situation. So that's an argument that the Turks have made and will continue to make. They're talking about reopening the highway actually all the way into Turkey eventually. So the Russians would be quite happy with that. The other thing is that Russia was really pissed, American pissed, not British pissed, with drones flying from and attacking the Hmeimim airbase there. And that has been a source of constant irritation for the Russians, and something that Turkey itself hasn't been able to clamp down on. So if you look at the map here, those dots here represent the various observation points of the Turkish military inside Idlib and of Iran and Russia outside along, it's very, these parties are set to keep the territory that they hold at the moment. Turkey, I will let Katie develop what Turkey's rationale is, but Turkey is actually in a weak position, and its leverage is decreasing from that perspective. So let's not be too complacent about what happened a week ago. If anything, I think the consensus, the expert consensus, is that it bought us some time, but the likelihood is that there will be a campaign. The question is, will it be a limited campaign just to capture the highways, or will it be a very comprehensive one where Assad seeks to retake the whole region? And the Russians, if you look at their statements in the past few days, are clearly indicating that this is not just the desired angle, but actually the planned angle of this whole Idlib diplomacy. Yeah.
So what are the implications of this agreement for the protection of civilians and any prospects for reconstruction then?
So a full-scale Idlib offensive would likely be one of, if not the worst humanitarian disaster in the conflict. We have around 3 million people in the area, half of whom have already been displaced from previous conflicts in Aleppo or Ghouta, and they already have very poor access to humanitarian supplies. Medical facilities are understaffed, undersupplied, and in the event of an offensive, all these things will be exacerbated. And Turkey, and especially areas of southern Turkey, has said that it won't open its borders to those fleeing, and we already have around 30,000 displaced from violence in August and September in Idlib, and it's just unclear really where all these people will go in the event of a full offensive, as Turkey has said that it won't open its borders, and it's recently closed 5 Syrian refugee camps in the country and located these people closer to the border with Syria. And so these are the constraints on Turkey, really. And then also Jordan, Lebanon equally have said that they won't take any more refugees. Similarly, the EU has expressed that it doesn't want to take any more refugees, but it doesn't have a clear strategy, because in the event of full-scale violence, these people will flee somewhere, and where that is unclear. It's likely they'll amass at the Turkish border, but then we've had recent reports of Turkish border guards firing at civilians trying to cross into the country. So the scale of violence will be huge, and this will likely push civilians to more danger, more like untold conditions, and it's just unclear who will take the burden.
Thank you. Well, so much to discuss here. We started with just the scale of the problem. We looked at the different implications, political and humanitarian and military implications, all the different actors involved in the conflict, both state actors and also the various non-state armed groups. And then we finished with this most recent development. So I hope that we sparked your interest somehow, and you'd like to ask any questions or have some comments. If you would like to do so, just please raise your hand and wait for me to call on you, and if you could just identify yourselves for the benefit of the other participants. I can see Nigel Linkster over there first.
Yeah, Nigel Linkster, Senior Advisor at IISS. We had this description of a conflict which has generated a very substantial population outflow. Experience in other conflicts suggests that this is not a net departure, that these people will continue in varying ways to be engaged with their country of origin, particularly economically. But can you give us a better idea of who's left? What does I mean, anything up to 50% of the Syrian population may have departed as a result of this conflict. Who's left? What do they look like? And what are the implications of this residual demographic for the regime?
Yeah.
It's a great question, because it is going to set the politics and the prospects for reconstruction and stabilization in Syria in the next phase. To answer who's left, we have to look at who's gone, who has left. And when you look at surveys of refugees in Europe in particular and so on, you realize that this is largely the most educated, skilled segment of the population that was the most likely to contribute to the economy, that had access to some capital, some networks, etc., to build this. So the million or so Syrian refugees that are in Europe are among the best contributing elements from that perspective, which is a reason not to panic too much about refugees. They do bring a skill set and so on. If you look at those in camps in Syria, in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Jordan, and so on, they tend to come from the poorer, rural classes of the population, and so apologies for how I'm saying it, but you'll understand me. Their needs tend to be more limited. They can be reintegrated more easily because they provide largely menial work and so on. It's also those who need the most humanitarian assistance at present. They're extremely vulnerable in current conditions, and they can't necessarily survive on their own if they're relocated elsewhere. Inside Syria, those who stay, aside from the IDPs, let Katie address this, because we're talking about 6.5 million IDPs or so. You have a large segment that are essentially government employees, bureaucrats, etc. Those who are either organically or opportunistically linked to the regime, and essentially survive because they're part of that network of loyalty that is there. There is limited money that goes around, but they tend to be on the winning side from that perspective. you still have a sizable merchant and industrial community inside the country, because they largely sided with Bashar al-Assad all along. But the question for them in this next phase is: do they turn into pure predators, or do they have something to contribute to the country? And when I say predators, we already see that kind of behavior emerging, where reconstruction is seen as a way to enrich yourself rather than a way to stabilize a country, bring back the population, and so on. There are some large projects in Aleppo, in Homs, in Damascus and elsewhere, that are going to be remembered as, first there will be Potankman villages, and second, they'll also be part of a project of demographic reengineering. Ultimately, when you look at the devastation in some urban areas, it's quite stunning. And it's unlikely that those residents will come back anytime soon. There isn't the money for it. The legal framework that are being adopted is designed to keep people away. So those who are left in Syria are going to be competing over a small pie, shrinking one, in which predators, because of the war economy and the post-war economy, will be much better positioned.
Would you like to add anything on IDPs, Katie?
I think it's also important to stress that in areas the regime has taken control of, they're now seen as stable. We still have ongoing violence. It might not be as immediately in terms of armed clashes and battlefront based, but we have reports of mass arrests, intimidation, forcible conscription, and there's still very shortage of aid access to these areas. So even in areas that the regime has taken control of and people may see the battle over in these places, civilians there are still suffering. So those that remain, they are still experiencing violence.
Adrian.
Adrian Crowdroy from the British Standards Institute is following on from the idea, the point Nigel was making, is when we're looking at displays at the people who are impacted, there's going to be a load of jihadists. Some of those, yes, they will go off to completely different areas to fight. There'll be some who become fatalities themselves, but there'll be a lot left behind, and that's not just the sort of Islamic State. There's people from alliance with the Syrian army who will also be angry. They're going to gravitate into particular areas. Part of my worry is there's the possibility that some of the other non-state armed groups in the area will start getting reinforced by these. And there's the potential for new conflicts breaking out, or small conflicts becoming larger.
Right. So, how are these jihadis going to impact other groups?
Well, there are jihadi groups. There are other groups, Islamist and non-Islamist groups that are not jihadi groups that also operate there. So we have to actually, break it down. Some jihadi groups, especially foreign jihadi groups, I'm thinking in particular the Turkestan Islamic Party that is actually based around the Jis al-Shuhur to the west of Syria. They have no place to go. These guys, I assume, will fight to the death. It's going to be quite ugly. And they'll do so against the Assad regime, against the Turks, against the Russians, and so on. Other groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, HTS today, that's a more complex problem because yes, there is certainly a hardcore in Jabhat al-Nusra, dedicated jihadis, global jihadis, I would argue. But they have also recruited a lot of Syrians who've joined just because they were the most powerful faction around. And so you can't assume that every Nusra fighter is a committed global jihadi. The question is, can these guys evolve? Can they be de-radicalized? Can they be part of some new settlement? The thing is that ISIS attracted a lot more committed jihadis than some of these other groups. Then you have the array of Islamist and more nationalist rebel forces that are now under essentially Turkish management, whether the National Liberation Front or the National Army in the northern Afrin and Euphrates region, and that's perhaps the best model. I mean, let's see if the Turks can make it really work, but where actually a country essentially takes charge of demobilizing those groups and reshaping them, their command, and so on. I don't want to be optimistic, because I'm not optimistic by nature when it comes to that. And then the record of Turkey in Afrin has been mixed. I mean, there is an active insurgency there. The groups that Turkey has backed have actually been quite brutal in a number of cases, and so on. Ultimately, unless we're talking about a genuine, inclusive political settlement, all this will fester. I mean, that's the big issue that we have. We're talking about rebels and jihadis on the rebel side. There's also a massive problem on the regime side that has appealed to large numbers of foreign fighters, much larger one, from Lebanon, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, etc. The question is this a foreign legion that Iran can mobilize and demobilize like that? What are their ideological and strategic ambitions? This is also something to worry about. They are a source of conflict as much as Sunni jihadis. The good thing with Sunni jihadis is that everyone agrees that they are a threat and a problem. So at least we start from that base. When it comes to others, there is no such political agreement.
Okay. The gentleman over there.
Martin Woodhead from Equinor. It kind of builds on, you answered it slightly there, but I just wonder what your reading is of how sophisticated Turkey is at managing both the cooperative and the competitive aspects of the jihadi relationship. And those of us with interest in Turkey, I mean, should we be reassured by what they're doing, or is this kind of storing up problems for the long term?
I mean, Turkey has had a very problematic approach to Syria all along. I mean, some of it was based on Turkey's own expectations of what the US, the West, others would do over time. So, essentially, they got complacent with the jihadi problem, calculating that soon enough, other countries will come together and we'll all manage this problem together, and so on, right? And so the point back in 2012, 13, 14 was how do we weaken Assad, and how do we get the Americans, the Europeans, a bunch of others on board to do that. It lost control of this dynamic. And it never had control of this dynamic, let me be clear. But my point is that this complacency really generated a massive blowback today. And so Turkey is essentially committing on the Sochi agreement, but also Astana and others, to defeat a large number of groups, and at a time where its own priority is containing the Kurdish movement. So Turkey has such competing priorities, it's very difficult to see it come on top of all that. The other thing is that Turkey has a relatively weak hand in all this. Russia has escalation dominance, as we saw. Russia is able to impose sanctions, bully, mollify, placate, etc. I mean, and we saw this. I don't want to portray Vladimir Putin as some kind of strategic genius, but at least tactically, he's been quite deft in how he's managed the relationship with Turkey, but also Israel. I mean, that's another country that also is struggling with all these dilemmas. The thing with Turkey is that it has a military, it has an economy, it has tools to help it stabilize some regions in Syria. I just think that it has very problematic allies, and Erdogan himself is struggling to make his case to other audiences internationally. Ask the Germans, ask other Europeans, ask the Americans about Menbish and so on. So Turkey doesn't come across as having a coherent approach to all that.
Nick, are there any questions from our webinar participants?
We have two sort of geopolitical questions, one of which follows on nicely from your comment there. which is, do you have any insight into how Russia's dual military campaigns in Ukraine and Syria are influencing one another? And the second questions, or set of questions, concern Israel. What are Israel's relationships with other groups in Syria? And do you think its efforts to disrupt the flow of weapons to Hezbollah and other Iranian-backed groups will have an impact on the post-conflict situation in the country?
In terms of Israel, we see their sort of constant small-scale involvement in the conflict in terms of airstrikes in areas of Syria that it says are Hezbollah weapons stores or Hezbollah weapons routes, and it's likely those will continue as it mainly targets these areas and it has untold damage on Hezbollah weapons stores and its control, but equally these strikes don't have as much of a larger impact as other involvements, so it's likely that these strikes will continue as there's no real opposition apart from the Iranian-backed forces to these. Like, Russia maintains a sort of distancing away from outwardly condemning these attacks. It does in name, but it's unlikely that it will intervene in this. So in that sort of sense, Israel will continue its presence in that way.
I mean, the other aspect of Israel's involvement in the conflict was its cultivation of groups, on the Golan Heights, in Koneitra and Deraa to some extent. And the priority there was to prevent the extension of, Hezbollah, Iran-supported forces, etc., to southern Syria, from which they could operate and, essentially open a second front in the north. Israel invested in some of those groups, mostly financial assistance, material assistance, some humanitarian assistance as well, and took on injured fighters and so on over the years. However, what we saw a few months ago is that as soon as the campaign, the Russian Assad campaign started in earnest in southern Syria and Deraa and so on, the Israelis didn't put up a fight. They didn't really strengthen their local guys. They basically made a deal with the Russians, first hoping to avoid a large number of refugees on its border, and we saw some of the pictures and so on. There were quite large numbers also on the border with Jordan. But second, investing in Russia in the hope that Russia itself would constrain Iran and its allies inside Syria. And just yesterday, the Russian Ministry of Defense released quite a stunning statement in which it listed all the things it did on behalf of Israel in southern Syria. I would urge you to look at. They named the number. They detailed the numbers of groups that got kicked out and the number of missile launchers that were dismantled and so on. I don't know if it's true or not, but at least this is how the Russians have presented themselves to Israel. So Israel has de facto abandoned those groups in the south. I mean, this is no longer they're no longer a factor in the military equation there. On the first question, which was, can you remind?
Concerns the relationship between Russia's campaign in Ukraine and in Syria.
So I know nothing about Ukraine, and I don't have an informed view on how Moscow itself looks at these two. At times it seems like Russia is more successful in Syria than in Ukraine, and at times it's the other way around. What is the ultimate Russian objective, is still a question, right? I mean, do they seek to use Ukraine to force some kind of European capitulation or whatever, and can they do it? Can they trade Syria for Ukraine? Again, it really depends on the balance of interest there, and again, as an uninformed observer from far, Ukraine seems to be more fundamental for Russian security than Syria is. And in any way, in Syria, Russia has obtained better than expected results from its campaign. So it actually can afford to cash in on it slowly, and it is the central actor today. So it can decide the terms of any trade over Syria at this point.
Justin Byrne, I'm a member here at WIS. You talked a bit about a settlement or some notion of a settlement. I'm not quite sure how clear any kind of outline of a settlement is, if at all, other than authoritarian peace, which presumably means suppression of all opposition. But so you might say something more about the extent to which there is a kind of some sense of what a settlement might be, maybe not tomorrow, but in the years to come. And in that context, the Kurds, I mean, the Kurds get a mention, but when you look at the map, I know it's mountainous and inhospitable, but it's a good chunk of Syria that is Kurdish and Kurdish controlled. And I just sort of wonder to what extent, at some stage, the Kurdish movement has to be snuffed out in some kind of settlement or in some other way absorbed.
First, it's difficult to foresee a settlement that somehow meets the most basic standards that we would hope for, so that the conflict doesn't start again, that 20 years from now we're not dealing with something even bigger. The fact that the insurrection of the 70s and 80s was in Syria was defeated the way it was defeated, contributed to a much bigger war this time. So the question is, if you don't deal with those issues today, what can happen 20 years from now? This is, by the way, one of the reasons why I think Assad's strategy from 2012 on was a strategy of depopulation. That there are people who can never be brought on board, so it's push them out, let them be a burden on other countries, on international agencies, etc. I don't want to take, as Assad, I don't want to take the responsibility of cultivating them and providing for their needs and so on. So from that perspective, I think the calculations of the Syrian regime are quite cynical. There are people with whom they don't want to deal. So if you don't kill them, better to send them away, and they become an issue here and in Lebanon and in Jordan and other countries. To more specifically to your point about the Kurds, first, they control a pretty rich region of Syria. This is where oil fields are, this is where water is, etc. What they don't have is an industrial base. The infrastructure is not well developed, so it's going to be quite difficult for. This region is rich, but it's not at a point where it's self-sustaining. And certainly the Kurds today depend on the US security support to exist as a political actor. They're not part of either the Astana or the Geneva tracks. That's in large part because the Turks oppose it, but also other Syrian opposition groups refuse it. They don't want them there because some Syrian opposition groups consider that the Turks have been double dealing essentially. That essentially they want to deal with the regime. They haven't contributed to the armed revolution against Assad. So they're, as far as they're concerned, they're outside the revolution. From that perspective, I'm being descriptive. I'm not offering my own take on that. So the Kurds are not part of a formalized peace process at this point, which is an aberration. When you look at the map of Syria, it's 25% of the territory. It's around 3 million, 4 million people. It's not something to discard. But the regime itself is not interested in having the Kurds be part of any formal track either, because what the regime is interested in is weaken Kurdish belief in U.S. commitment and so on, so that at one point the Kurds will have an interest in accepting a less than satisfactory offer from the regime itself. So we were talking at some point about autonomy. Autonomy is not in the cards. Federalism is not in the cards. Decentralization is not in the cards as far as the regime is. What the regime is willing to give them is very minor local governance at a town, village level, and so on, but not as in a region. So the Kurds themselves, are wondering, what will we get from the regime? But ultimately, if you're there, you're wondering who has staying power, who's going to be around in 10, 15, 20 years. Is it going to be the Americans or the others? In this regard, it's difficult to understate how important the U.S. decision in 2013 not to strike was. I mean, it did broadcast to a lot of people that no matter how vocal Washington can be on those issues, ultimately it's not that invested, and so every party in Syria is hedging today.
Thank you. Nigel, did you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, really following on from the other questions about Russia, some while back, Vladimir Putin more or less did a reiteration of George W. Bush and said, job done, we're out of here. They're not out of there. So, do you think that Russia still has a coherent exit strategy? And relating to that, a little while ago, Putin more or less said to Europe, well, we broke this place, now you guys ought to come in and fix it. What do you think, the response to that latter statement should be on the part of the Europeans?
Pause. I'm going to take the final question.
Well, my question links to that.
Perfect.
Actually, because you mentioned Clint Evans and Constellis. You said two things about Europe, which is, one, they didn't want any more refugees, and two, they had no strategy. And I think you suggested in an earlier talk that the European interest was to pump lots of money in for reconstruction in order to inhibit further flows. Is that roughly where the Europeans are coming from? And does it make any sense at all?
I'll let you answer some of the reconstruction thing. Let me pick up the Russia angle first. I don't think Putin is thinking in terms of an exit strategy. Again, I strongly believe that Russia had better than expected results in Syria. So basically, yes, there is an entanglement. At times it's uncomfortable. But I think internally in Russia, the system can justify the presence in Syria. I think there are other, secondary effects, positive effects, as far as Russia is there. Rotation of forces. It was a live ground training exercise. There are significant issues. The second thing is that a number of Middle Eastern powers now want to do business with Russia. It seems transactional, straightforward. The Russians don't care about human rights, environmental issues, labor laws, or anything like that. So if you're a autocratic leader in the region, it feels better. I don't necessarily believe that the Russians necessarily can provide what they want down the road. And the Russians are not necessarily good at financing large projects. They want the cash on those things. The Russians not going to necessarily think in terms of structural reforms, etc. Things that Western countries, international organizations, etc. have to worry about. I also think that the standards for Russia are much lower than people expect. I mean, you mentioned Russia's dealings with Europe and so on. I mean, eventually what Russia wants is, one, to rehabilitate and legitimize Assad, bring him back. That will be, I think, the big diplomatic success domestically and internationally for them. I don't know, the day Bashar al-Assad flies to New York, perhaps for UNGA, it's not impossible to envisage at this point. The second thing is that they want to relegitimize Assad so that they actually can obtain international financial assistance to rebuild Syria. The Russians are not interested in putting a single dollar, ruble, whatever, into into Syria unless it's a lucrative enterprise. If you look at UN reports on donor countries, Russia, I think, is around $5 million or some, like, you know, the IKEA Foundation contributes more towards Syrian refugees through the UN than Russia itself. Russia has some bilateral programs, but they're still very limited. So no, the Russians are not in it for that. They want others to pay. To your point, I think it's an illusion, by the way, to think that if you pay, you're going to have leverage. It's one of the many illusions we've had about Syria and Russia ever since 2011, that Russia can moderate Assad, that Russia will prevent Assad from using chemical weapons, that, you know, Russia will get Assad to respect ceasefires in 2016, or that you know, Russia will get Assad to not attack the de-escalation zone. I mean, you know, these are broken ones. The thing with reconstruction, with this kind of language, is that you have the most leverage until you sign the first check, and then you're entangled, and then you're, you know, it drops massively.
And just a point on reconstruction is we have all these EU officials and Western officials saying that they won't contribute to reconstruction until an inclusive political process under the auspices of the UN is running, but their leverage in terms of securing that is very low. The regime isn't interested in such an agreement. And whilst the EU and the West may say that they won't contribute to reconstruction until this happens, it's possible the regime will say, okay, and we don't, they need the money, but they will not want to give up their leverage in terms of a political process. So it is clear that funds for reconstruction are needed, as around over $300 billion of damage or so. And this is necessary, but it's unlikely that the EU and the West will be able to use this as leverage as they hope, and it's really their last remaining leverage in a way.
And the Americans are not at all entertaining the discussion, and they have, you know, amassing voting power at the World Bank and elsewhere. So, you know, it's difficult to see that happening. I mean, European countries are a bit wobbly. The Americans are set against.
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid this is all we had time for. Well, we covered so much ground. I hope you found it of interest. As I said at the very beginning, this is just the first in a series of monthly conflict briefings that we are going to organize. So we'll soon be circulating details of the next briefing. We would very much welcome your feedback. As I said, this is a new format that we are trialing. So if you have any comments, you can email them to us at conflictbriefing@iiss.org. And also, we will be hanging around for a little while. So if you have any comments that you want to share here, or if you want to learn more about our conflict analysis work and the armed conflict database in particular, please come and talk to the four of us. We also have our colleague Robert in the room there. At the very back also, Gaynor, Helen, Shirley, and Tom, so please come and talk to us. We'd love that. So thank you again for taking the time to join us. Thank you for your comments. Thank you to those who have joined us remotely via webinar. And among all, thank you to our speakers.